Hello and welcome to the Rebel Entrepreneur Summit. I am Dawn Gluskin and I am interviewing some amazing thought leaders who are openly sharing with us not only their successes but some of their struggles along the way. And I happen to think it's a great act of rebellion to show up as who you really are in the world, but specifically in the business world. So what better person to talk to us about authenticity and vulnerability in business than Corey Blake. Hello, Corey. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Dawn. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. Glad to have you. So if you're not familiar with Corey's work, he is the founder and CEO of Roundtable Companies, which is a creative agency that works with storytelling to help people market authentically, as well as to make some cultural shifts and to develop brand identity. Prior to that, he was an actor in LA for some time, and one of his claims to fame there was being in a top 50 Super Bowl commercial, which I think you said just so happened you had to get naked for.
Different commercial, but but I did
another commercial. And then more recently, he has done a really great TED Talk on vulnerability. He writes for Forbes.com, the Huffington Post. He's been in the New York Times, lots of great stuff. So really excited to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So I guess to get started, you want to talk a little bit about the work that you do at Roundtable, and I guess too, how did you make the shift from acting to a creative agency doing storytelling?
Sure. Maybe I'll start there. As an actor, I loved performance and I loved creating experiences for people. But I didn't go out to LA to inspire kids to drink more sugar water or eat hamburgers. And eventually that was a big part of my income was commercials for Fortune 500 companies and voiceover stuff. And I was doing some TV and some film, but it was on a smaller scale. And I felt like a creative tool for other people. And had to wake up one day to that reality that I was building a career and a lucrative income stream that was not in alignment with my higher purpose. Yeah. So there's a lot of pain around that, to be candid. And I had a 3-year transition out of Hollywood that was very challenging for me because I didn't know who I would be if I wasn't an actor. I didn't know who I was. Mm-hmm. But I had started RTC initially as a writing company and doing very traditional, not necessarily inspired writing, like ebooks on foot fungus and articles on why you should eat chocolate kind of stuff. And, but thankfully, because of my background, we were quickly attracting coaches and CEOs who wanted us to support them in writing books. And that became huge focus of our work, which led to the exploration of vulnerability and authenticity that leads us to where we are now. So to answer that piece of your question, we deal a lot at the root of all of this. We're dealing a lot with identity change. Mm-hmm. People who are at a point in their life where they're evolving into something new, either individually or as an organization, which means they have to revise the story that's driving their behavior.
Right.
The internal story and the external story and all that. And so we help the reshaping of that and the emergence of that new story so that the behavior can shift and new opportunities and results can become possible. And I love the work, and we do it, like I said, a lot of it is individual and then a fair amount of it is organizational.
Very cool. Very cool. I love using storytelling in business. I think it's powerful. You know, it's a great way to present yourself authentically. Like people, I think, have a filter. They know when they're being sold to, and they're, you know, it just doesn't feel right. But when we openly share our authentic selves, even though it goes against everything you ever heard about the corporate world, you know, you got to dress a certain way, talk a certain way. But it's so powerful, and it's good to see that a lot of companies are starting to shift that way. But there is, like I said, it's kind of a stigma, like, you know, you got to show up a certain way in the world. Don't talk about your failures, you know, don't let them see you sweat. There's all that out there in the business world. Mm-hmm. So what kind of resistance do you get when you're talking to clients about being more vulnerable, more authentic, and more real in their business? Like, what are you hearing?
Well, we are very intentional about the way that we show off what we do in the world. And so the blessing of that is we primarily attract people who get it.
Right.
They don't know how to do it, but they get it. So I deal with the resistance of those people, which is personal resistance, which is a lot of fear that comes up as you're emerging into a new story. You hit your ceilings and your limits, what you perceive as possible for yourself, who you've been, who you are. There's a lot of challenge around self-identification. So there's plenty of resistance for the people who have already bought in.
Right.
My perception is we're dealing with 3% of corporate America that's in that have bought in phase of my authenticity is very powerful and actually a key to my business growth. And so I don't have a whole lot of experience with the other 97%, but I'm aware certainly that it's out there. And my perception is that the resistance to this kind of authenticity is pretty strong.
Yeah. Yeah, especially in the corporate world, I could see it's going to take a long time for the real big companies to get on board. But, you're starting to see a lot more, like you said, coaches, consultants, the smaller companies really taking advantage of being who they are in their business, which is great because that's who we want to buy to. I know when I'm deciding if I want to buy from a company, I often go to their about page. And it's like, well, who am I spending my money with? Do they align with me? I want to see that they're human. So there's so much value in that.
Mm.
But when we talked before, you had given a really good example of one of your clients, and she was the naked dancer. Do you want to talk a little bit about her story? Because it was a really good one.
Yeah, Lori Darley is an amazing human being. And I was introduced to her. Her husband is an attendee of the Conscious Capital CEO Summit. And we were both in that space and really appreciated each other. I was out in Dallas and he said, let's go to dinner. I'd love for you to meet my wife. And we're sitting down talking, and she reveals that she has this book that she's been working on for quite some time, and shared with me that she had been a dancer for 40 years, choreographer, ran her own dance company for a long period of time. And then for the past 15 years, she's been an executive coach. And the book was really all focused on this executive coaching component and the work she was doing with leaders. And she believed, as many of us do, that she needed to keep the dancing piece hidden because it would be viewed by her prospective clientele as soft or woo-woo. My language, not necessarily hers.
Right.
And as we were talking, I was starting the nudging process of trying to inspire her along the notion of what is it for you to fully represent who you are. Right. The beauty of your embodied presence and your ability to connect at that spiritual dance level with everything that you have built now over 15 years in working with leaders. And she worked with our organization for over a year on her book, and what has materialized is called Dancing Naked. It's actually being released, I think, October 4th. It's just coming up here. And it is this beautiful combination of full expression of her and everything she brings to the table as someone who came from the bodied experience of connection with ourselves and then shifted into this corporate world.
Yeah.
But what I love about Lori is I've experienced her work in the room, and it is so beautiful and profound. And I've had huge epiphanies in her workshops, and they happen when she helps me get out of here and fully start entering the space of who I am as a whole human being.
Right.
So now the book is an invitation for leaders into what is it to have an embodied experience of leadership in your life. And I think it is just stunning.
Well, I love that because I could feel the struggle of having like, this is who I am, this is who I show up for in my business, and this is who I was, and like having to put them in two separate boxes, and it probably just doesn't feel good or feel right. And just by, owning her whole story and, just bringing the whole thing to the table, like a holistic approach, I'm imagining probably opened up things for her in her own personal life and her business. And it sounds like it's going to be a great book. So, and the title is awesome too.
It is. It is. Yeah, if I can speak to that real quickly, that I can't speak to it for Lori, but for myself, I was just on a call yesterday where this opened up for me, this realization. I mentioned I had been an actor before, and there was the pain of that transition in my own work as a thought leader. And, I'm shifting from running the company now to being this public face, a stand for vulnerability and storytelling and connection. And one of my big obstacles was the integration of the performer that I used to be.
Right.
And I think a piece of that was because I had locked that away. I had struggled so much with, if I'm not an actor, who am I? That the idea of bringing some of that back in was something I was avoiding. It was a hard notion of, well, what if I'm not as talented as I used to be? What if the stage isn't as comfortable as it used to be? What if I can't remember my lines the way that I used to be able to? That stuff was not readily accessible to my conscious mind, but It was an obstacle. And now, for me, this shift into thought leadership has been about that integration of who I used to be and who I am now, meaning now shifting me into the emergence of who am I becoming.
Yeah. I love that. It's amazing, like the stories that we tell ourselves, like how you can't be this and that, or, and then we're really just putting up these huge roadblocks for ourselves. But when we get past that, like you said, it's this integration and all these things. I'm sure, that's why so much stuff is opening up for you in your life, because you've, so authentically, bring it all together and bring it to the table.
Trying every day.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things you said to me, is that you want to walk your talk, or live, you teach vulnerability, you work with people on vulnerability. So you try to put yourself out there. And I've seen some of your emails where you talk about, well, these are my successes, but here, let me tell you about all the missteps along the way, or the struggles that I had within those successes. So, well, how do you feel about that? I mean, is that easy for you to share? Or you just because a lot of times we wear our mistakes and our failures is I don't want anyone to know that. They're going to judge me. Like, how do you feel about I'm just going to tell the whole world about it? How does that work out for you? And
I'm practiced to a certain level. So there are some things, especially professionally, that I've become very comfortable in sharing. There's some things personally that I'm become very comfortable in sharing. It's not unusual on stage for people to hear stories about the opportunity I had to have an affair in my marriage.
Your TED Talk. Or no, that was a
different. Yeah, right. So relationships and how romance has shown up in my life, and the way that my soul gets fulfilled,
right,
and how that's manifested. That's a topic that, yes, I talk about. How I have failed, how I have eroded trust through unprofessional boundaries. Right. But also recognizing where other people use the boundaries as an excuse to explore. I've really played with that boundary topic, especially with the women that I work with in my life throughout my whole career. And in some cases, I've made such a total mess that my companies blew up. My first 2 storytelling iteration companies exploded as a result of that. But I had to go through that in order to figure out how to set up a boundary. And then I set up such a strong boundary that I became emotionally unavailable to a number of the women that I worked with. And only 5 years, 6 years into that process was I challenged to find a better balance again. So the pendulum, I'm a big pendulum swinger. So I'm very open to sharing those kinds of stories. I think that they're really important for us to hear because they're so human.
Right. And that's important. And especially even in business, because people forget, we like to do business with other humans, the corporate world has such a bad, reputation because they're all about money. And when you realize you're working with people, that's the value it brings to business, which is the power of storytelling. But when you talked about how you set boundaries, now what did that look like? Was that like an actual conversation that you had, or was that just a limit you set within yourself, or or both? Or
it was not a public conversation. It was an intuitive decision. I had just gotten married, And so in my past, I had cheated on my college girlfriend at one point. When I moved out to LA, for 2 years, somewhere between a year and a half and 2 years, I dated a married woman and thought I was being a hero in that relationship because she seemed so unhappy in her marriage. And I justified that relationship. And it was a profoundly loving relationship. Like, it still holds a tremendous amount of meaning in my life. And then on a film project after that, I was directing a project and directed the leading actress, and blew up that whole experience after we had created this marvelous film that I adored. The creative romantic energy that had gone into film production. Once we were done, I realized, I'm not really in love with this person. I was in love with our process. And that was really hurtful to this woman.
Right.
So her trust for me completely eroded. A bunch of our crew's trust for me was then in question. And so I blew that one up. So then got married, started Roundtable, and determined in a very subconscious way that in order to protect my marriage and not continue to make these mistakes, I needed to carry certain walls. I needed to ensure I didn't get too close to the point where I felt dangerous to myself, where I could make a bad decision here. I didn't trust myself to make a good decision. So what I trusted myself to do was never get in that scenario in the first place. So that was this limit that I set up, and I lived that out for years until eventually, kind of as a group, it was determined that this was now a hindrance to our growth, and I needed to figure out how to take that wall down.
Yeah. Yeah, but I love the fact that you so openly share about this, because what are considered probably like taboo subjects, right? And a lot of people could probably have very similar stories to you, different details, but similar stories, who never speak about it publicly. But I think, there's obviously, when you whole step in, there's the shame, right? That's not a good feeling to carry around. But there's also, you said you've lost trust, but I think probably openly sharing about it, you probably gained a lot of trust back too, is another benefit. And it's refreshing. Yeah. It's refreshing that you are open and you don't worry about, people aren't going to do business with me, but they probably still are, because they see you as human.
There's a number of responses that I think are really worth sharing. One is that, as you were saying that out loud, I was recognizing internally that shame actually, for me, has transitioned into pride. Mm-hmm. I'm certainly not happy that I hurt other people or that I hurt families, right? Any of that was not a desirable outcome. But I can, at the same time that I can hold space for the hurt that was caused, I can also hold space for appreciation that I was in the ring trying to figure something out. I had good intentions. Intentions are by no means everything. Right. But I can see the progression of the journey and be proud that I was someone who was fighting to become a better person throughout each of those steps. And now, as opposed to if I was to remain shut down and harbor that shame, I would not have grown, and I wouldn't be able to do the things that I am now in service to the world in the way that I am now. So I can feel pride and appreciation around that. You also mentioned, how to are other people afraid of doing business with you? And I find that the more that I put myself out there, the more that two things happen. The people who appreciate authenticity and who can see a version of themselves in my story, they make themselves known. Right. And suddenly we're doing business together or finding a way to interact that is useful and valuable to both parties. And those people tend to be very strongly attracted. Right. So as opposed to being on the sideline and just, paying it, like, they make themselves known. Similarly, people who are repelled by me find me dangerous, or if I bring up things that don't make them feel good about themselves, they run screaming in the opposite direction, and I don't have to spend any time or energy, and neither do they, trying to see if this is a good relationship. Right. So there's this awesome save of time, resources, and energy. Yeah. And as a company, we work, 95% of our clientele are people that our staff go to bed every night insanely in love with. And the other 5%, it's just for some reason or other became more transactional than we anticipated it would be. But because we project ourselves this way, the people who really come a calling are the people that are totally right for us. And as a business advantage, it's huge on just such a tremendous number of levels. The biggest one for me, I think, being I get to watch my staff alive with everything that we touch. There's very little transaction in our business. It's all transformational work for everyone who touches it. And that is just so personally gratifying for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think there's a couple of really important messages in there. And one is that for anyone that's listening that can relate in any way, just holding something that they're maybe ashamed of and that is so it's healing to just, come to terms with it. And then you can actually grow from that journey and to turn it into to growth. But also that, sometimes when you're open and vulnerable, you might repel some people, like you said, but first of all, it's going to be a small percent. And second of all, well, that's good because you don't necessarily want to work with those people anyway. So I think that's a really important message to people that are hearing this and saying, well, I don't know if I want to be sharing everything, but of course you have to share what you're comfortable with, but there is way more good than bad, So I wanted to talk about vulnerability is sexy, which is where your new branding is going. And also you have a really cool board game and a really cool shirt. So before you tell us what that is exactly, I think most people, when they hear the word vulnerability, even if you just go by the Webster definition, which talks about vulnerability is opening yourself up for attack. So I think most people, if they think of an S word, they're going to say vulnerability is scary or, find in some other word, not necessarily sexy. Mm-hmm. So what's that all about?
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. I fully admit that the act of being vulnerable when I'm experiencing it, I don't feel sexy in the moment. But what happens when I am the recipient of vulnerability, when I see someone have the courage to share something that I can tell is not easy for them to share, I get turned on. And that's not to say I get sexually aroused, but it's to say that there's a fire in me that cannot deny that I'm respecting that courage. Right. So to me, it is a sexiness. There's the act of being courageous is a turn on.
Right.
As a human being, like I feel proud for that person. I'm stoked. I'm excited. Right. Like part of me wants to champion them and run around and scream. Did you see what that person just did? That was so hard. Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah. Right. So that's where the sexy piece to me comes in. I fully honor that when I'm in a moment of vulnerability, sharing something for the first time, the last thing I would think I was being was sexy. Right. And it certainly doesn't feel that way. I like it, yeah. But when I experience it from others, I find it to be a turn on. So that's really, I think, the origin around the tagline. We had stumbled across it internally. We deal a lot with vulnerability. It's been a topic for years. And when we landed on that phrase and those two words being paired together and started using it, what we noticed was it was an immediate trigger for people and they wanted to engage in a conversation. Mm-hmm. And so we followed that energy, and that's why it's become the kind of movement and leading figure of our brand now that it is.
And when you say a trigger, I imagine both positive and negative reactions, or?
Yeah, mostly what we see is positive reactions, but it does have some challenging reactions. Internally, we've even had people at our company who have really struggled with it, which I also understand. We employ a number of more introverted personality types, artists, writers, editors, and they're gorgeous human beings. But the idea of pairing those words together has been challenging for a number of people on our staff. And for some of those folks, putting this out there the way that I have helped them determine that actually they needed to move away from the company. And so we had to engage in as healthy as possible closure for those people. And you know what? It was an amazing opportunity and experience to honor that these are staff members who've been a part of getting us where we are. But for whatever reason, the story that they are living around their work and what they're doing was no longer in alignment with the way that I was featuring vulnerability as sexy. That allowed them to find something that is more in alignment with them and created space at the company for us to find people who are in alignment with where we're going. The previous version of me from only a few years ago would have felt like I needed to fight for those relationships, would have taken it personally, this, that, the other thing. But thankfully, through, I think, enough personal development work that I've been doing and engaging in this vulnerability work, I was in a place where I could honor that this was bringing up feelings that indicated that these people actually needed to part ways from this. So it's across the board. But we do get a tremendous amount of, I would say, curiosity, or there's a lot of kind of that yes response, right? Like I get it at the airport a lot. I always wear my vulnerability is sexy shirt at the airport. I find a lot of people smile at me, and sometimes I forget I'm wearing my t-shirt and I just think it's a lovely day with so many happy people. A lot of people smiling at my t-shirt. TSA agents always say something. And then I have people who come up to me and say, if I knew you, I would take that off of you so that I could own it. Right? Or people who want to give me a hug that I've never met before. So for some people, it is an affirmation of a lifestyle that they believe is valuable too.
That's awesome. And I'm glad that you shared that story too, because there's a lot of entrepreneurs listening to this. And, you know, I think entrepreneurs struggle sometimes with that, maybe having an idea that's a little bit more provocative or a little unconventional. And they tiptoe, they're like, I don't know if I want to go here, because like you said, you ended up losing employees over it. And for a lot of entrepreneurs, that could be scary. Like, I don't want to do something that's going to affect my company and have people leaving, and you just presented it as a positive, you know, I mean, you know, I'm sure that there was some stuff you had to go through, and I'm sure you were sad to see them go and things like that. But, you know, it's all about alignment. And if you feel in alignment with something, that I think that's really important in business. And sometimes you have to like take the jump and, you know, see what happens.
The more aligned our team is, the more powerful we are. Right. So a friend of mine reminded me of how people summit Mount Everest, right? You spend more time, I think, going down the mountain than you do actually going up, because you go up from the first level to the second, and then you have to come back down to reacclimate, and then you go back up, and then you come down, and then you go to the third, and then you go back to the second, and then down to the first. And you're spending as much time going down. And this exercise of representing authentically what you stand for and expressing that, it allows people to determine, do we want to summit this mountain together or not?
Right.
And also determine which people are meant to stay at base camp, which people are meant to go to the tip top of the mountain, and which people don't belong on the mountain at all. The more we figure all of that out, the more profoundly powerful we become as an organization, and the impact we have enhances.
Yeah.
I am so all for this kind of work.
Yeah.
You know, companies talk about A, B, and C players. An aligned company is full of A players.
Yeah.
Constantly working in this direction is huge for business growth.
So don't be scared of going down the mountain again, just so you can go up higher. Right?
Getting used to. Yeah, you're right. I think we're afraid of it until we've experienced it. Right. So getting into the mix and taking our lumps and getting comfortable with the discomfort of being unreasonable is big.
And that's what I think most successful entrepreneurs out there, that's exactly what happens. They get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's just the way it goes. It's the nature of the beast. But I wanted to ask you too, so if someone's listening to this right now and they maybe have a vulnerable story and they're thinking like maybe sharing it with the world and with their business, inside of their business, but there's reservations. I mean, do you have any sort of rules or tips around that? Like, you know, don't share something if it's going to give you anxiety and you're never going to sleep again, or like what's, you know, just kind of your general rule of thumb you would tell people in that mindset?
Yeah. We do have a process for this. Interestingly, it's interesting to me anyway. We developed it through our book process. We determined that the book writing process is so fragile. We really encourage people to not share it for quite some time. And then it gets to a phase where we say, okay, now's the time where we want you to find one person that you feel awesomely safe with. And I want you to share with that person. And they'll share the writing with that person, and the response will be amazing because it is always an invitation into their soul. And when the response is amazing, I find this so fascinating. The immediate response from the person who shared is, well, you have to tell me that you love me. So we have this amazing ability to immediately disregard validation. And then it says, so then we say, okay, awesome. great job doing that first step. Now we need to take it out to someone who's a little less safe.
Right.
So then maybe they'll go to someone they work with, right? And as soon as that person validates, again, the human condition being what it is, the response usually is, well, that person knows me, or they will find a reason to rationalize, right? Great, but it's the next concentric circle outwards to build confidence and trust in the value of what you're sharing. So then we say, awesome, now you need to go out one step further to someone you trust even less. Who is that? And then maybe that's a group of people.
Right.
And suddenly, when the response across the board is so favorable, that's when the person can no longer doubt the significance of what it is they're sharing and the power of what they're sharing. So first step, find someone that you determine is safe, and set yourself up. This is another important aspect of this. Vulnerability needs a strong setup. It needs some agreements. Yeah. You know, before I share something vulnerable with you, it's really wise for me to say, hey, I have something that's really vulnerable for me to share. Is this a good time for you to sit and just listen to what I have to say? And are you able to be present with me? And are you comfortable with the idea that I'm not asking you to solve this for me or save me or rescue me from my own feelings? I really just would love for you to listen. Can you do that?
Yeah.
You set yourself up for a positive outcome. So those are a couple of tips to start the practice.
That's a good process. And I could see how it would help people build their confidence muscles, and also see that, you know, people aren't going to judge you. And like, you know, the stories we make up in our head are just kind of ridiculous sometimes, but it's just proof that it's in our head and it's not reality.
Well, I think it's a precautionary measure that's important, because if you were to go out to the world first and you received rejection, would you ever try again, right? Then you have to overcome that scar. So the other important difference is that if you take it out to one person and then someone less safe and then a group of people, then when you do take it out to the world and somebody does come against you, right, and respond with negative energy, you've got a field of protective people around you, and you're not alone in that process. And you can counter that negativity with a tremendous amount of positive energy. If you take it out to the world first before you're ready, you can do yourself, I think, some serious damage. So I think this process is a wise one.
Yeah, I like that. So I'm just watching the time there, and I see we're getting close to the end, but there is one other question I wanted to ask, and I've asked of all the interviews. You know, a lot of times in the business world, we see these sort of cookie cutter, you know, do this and, you know, you're guaranteed success. But I think it's important that people know that everyone's path to success is unique. So my question is, you know, what is some business advice that you got that probably on the surface seemed like really solid, good, logical advice, but just wasn't good for you? So it turned out to be maybe some of the worst advice that you took in your business. Is there something that comes to mind for you?
There is. I had an experience with a client in 2014 that I ended up having a very close relationship with this client. It was a gentleman, and he was writing a very worthy story, and we were working on that book with him. And he was someone that I felt a strong calling to learn from. He was very graceful in the moment. He had a lot of wisdom that he carried with him. And he loved our process and what we did. Now, he had also sold a substantial company and had some significant assets, and he wanted to be of help. And so we started conversations around what would it look like financially for him to get involved. Right. And through that conversation, his advice to me was that we should significantly reduce our margins on the work we were doing on his project, because the success of that project was going to lift the tide for everyone. Mm-hmm. And I followed that path and reduced our margins significantly, but it was to the point that it was harmful to the company. And then when these conversations around him actually becoming a potential partner in the company, when those didn't materialize, I was kind of left without the necessary profitability on that project. And we had put tremendous time and energy into that relationship and everything that we were hoping it was going to become.
Yeah.
Now, here's the interesting piece of that I think is also worth considering. It was such an important part of our story that I took that advice and failed from it, because the other piece was we were kind of waiting for the client who was going to become the ideal poster for what we do as an organization. We're 10 years old and we didn't have that emblematic thing that people could look at and go, okay, it's possible for me too. A lot of great people who have been successful through our program, but not a kind of celebrity figure.
Yeah.
And the failure in putting that faith in a client and the pain that was involved around that was the impetus for me to finally say, I can't wait for one of our clients to take the full journey that's required to create a thought leadership brand, because it's immense.
Yeah.
I said, I have to be that for our clients. Our clients need to see me do that. And that's what started Vulnerability is Sexy and led to me going out and doing speaking and this documentary that we're doing and me getting involved in these CEO communities. It has been an awesome impetus to us. So I wouldn't say that the advice was bad on the whole.
Right.
I wouldn't do it again.
Right. Right. So, and I think you're very good at finding like the treasure and the muck sometimes.
Eternal optimist, of course.
That's awesome. Yay.
Thank you for the question.
Well, I really appreciate your time today, and it was great talking to you. But I did want to let everyone know that if you want more from Corey, he has a really good opt-in on his website. It's called Thought Leadership is Sexy. So you can go to roundtablecompanies.com, or you can also click on the rebelentrepreneur.biz, B-I-Z, and click on his photo and get it through there. So did you want to talk a little bit about what that is? And
yeah, sure. So Thought Leadership is Sexy is a weekly informative newsletter, it's a personal piece from me about what I'm doing in the thought leadership realm. The first piece that people get helps describe how I generated $186,000 in 3 months through my personal Facebook page.
wow.
I'm blown away by it. I'm fascinated by how Facebook works as compared to other social media. And I invite people into, here's exactly what I'm doing with my Facebook page that's turning into some incredibly legitimate business. So that's the first piece. So it's intended to be new thought. Like, I don't know anyone else that's talking specifically about that, about the ways in which I'm engaging this whole thought leadership role. Every week I'm doling out the best information that I can share with people who want to follow in this path.
Awesome. Good stuff. Yeah, definitely go download that, because who doesn't want to make $180,000 on Facebook in 3 months? And then where else can people follow you too? Like, where are you most? Twitter, Instagram, Facebook? What's the best?
Facebook is where I spend, I spend considerable time, probably an hour a day. I'm on Twitter like 5 minutes a day, and I'm on LinkedIn once every 3 days. So certainly Facebook is the place if you want to kind of get an idea of what I'm up to regularly.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Corey. It's been great talking to you.
Likewise, Don. Thank you. This was fun.